Yo, welcome to Sig Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Sig Slayer, chilling with Mark, the honorable villain. What up, fam?
What's up, Mike? I'm ready. We have a great writer on our hands today.
This is wild. Today we have one of my favorite stories, author of one of my favorite stories, Pornsak Pichetshote. I can't wait to talk about The Good Asian with him. But before we talk to Pornsak, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right. Here we go. Our next guest, Dash Fam, is a former editor for Vertigo, a fan favorite imprint. Now he's a writer for an Eisner Nominated title, The Good Asian. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you Pornsak Pichetshote.
Thanks for having me.
We are thrilled to have you. Let's just dive right on in. Since it's your first time joining us, we always like to get your comic book origin story, meaning how did you get your first gig in pro comics?
Oh, my first gig in pro comics. Okay, so my first gig in pro comics, well, I guess my first gig, it depends. If you count retail pro comics, my first gig was working at the Millionaire Picnic in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think it is the oldest comic book store in America. And I was looking for a part-time job. I was writing. I quit a job to write full-time, and I realized I need a little extra money I worked this full-time job for about a year, saving up money so I could take some years off to write, but then realized it would help to get like a little extra something on the side and get me out of the house. And so I took a job at my local comic book store, which was the Millionaire Picnic. And the Millionaire Picnic would come out and have a bunch of like great people come out from that. There was an imprint called High Water Books that was published out of that. So like some of Brian Ralph's first books, Ron Rigi, a lot of the underground sort of comic scene, Leela Corman, Tom Devlin, who now works at Drawn and Quarterly, worked out of there. So there was a lot of great like indie alternative comics that were coming out of Millionaire Picnic when I was working there.
Wow. Okay. So that was kind of like your initiation period.
Yeah.
How did you get a gig working for a publishing company?
Okay.
What capacity job was that?
Yeah. So my first like professional jobs in like comics making was assistant editor at Vertigo for Karen Berger, and I fell ass backwards into that job. I was not looking for a full-time job. I think I just quit the job that I was working or something like that, or basically I'd set myself out like, I'm gonna do this freelance writing thing. I'm gonna go without a net. I'm not looking for any full-time work. I was getting by working on film crews and like picking up odd jobs here and there, but didn't want to get a day job. And all my friends knew that. And then a friend of mine reached out to me and was like, listen, I know you're not looking for a day job, but there is the editor-in-chief of Vertigo is looking for an assistant editor. And I have no idea what any of those words mean, but it feels like you would. And it feels like it's something you'd be into. And I was a huge Vertigo fan, huge fan of Karen Berger. So I took that job interview just to meet her. I didn't really think I would get the job. I didn't know if I wanted a full-time job. I was taking like little temp jobs on the side just to get by, but I really wanted to like focus on like writing. And had an interview with Karen, that went well. She had me take an editing test, that went well. She had me come back for a second interview, that went well. And they offered me the job, and I still didn't know if I wanted the job. But then I was kind of like, I'm taking these like 3 to 6 months temp gigs. Worst case scenario, I worked this for a year, and and after that I go back and freelance, but I've learned so much from being on the other side of the desk. And so I took that job, and that ended up being like over a decade at DC Comics, starting with like 7 years at Vertigo, and then 3 to 4 years coming out on the West Coast to work on their TV stuff.
If you can name a couple of your influences as a writer, and it doesn't necessarily have to be comics, because writers draw from all inspiration from everywhere.
So the writers that I love, well, starting from comics, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Chester Brown, Joe Sacco. Those are my 4 big sort of comic influences. Prose, it's Italo Calvino, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Grace Paley. TV and film, it's Aaron Sorkin. So those are kind of all like that hodgepodge of like influences that I have.
So Pornsak, for your first writing gig, how did you manage to get a Flashpoint story? Did you need to collaborate with Geoff Johns in order to tell that story?
So yes, I did, but I was that was a weird thing where we all collaborated with Geoff Johns to tell that story. Basically, it was a weird thing where I was at Vertigo. I was recruited at the time. DC had recruited me and Geoff had recruited me to be part of a think tank to turn comics into other media. And so this was around the time where the first Green Lantern trailer had dropped. There was word that David E. Kelley was doing a Wonder Woman show for NBC. And DC wanted to do more. I mean, this was coming right after all of, Marvel's blockbuster success, where Warner Brothers was like, we have a comic book company. Why can we only make Batman movies? And so they wanted to they brought Geoff in to kind of to make DC more of a multimedia company. And he brought a bunch of us out from the East Coast to kind of be his lieutenants in different things. And I had never worked with Geoff before. And we would talk about this a lot. Geoff was DC guy, I was Vertigo guy. I never did anything DC, Geoff never did anything Vertigo, so we didn't really know each other at all. And so one of the things that Geoff had done was, when he started this Flashpoint thing, he broke out a couple smaller projects, one-shots here and there, just to work with some of his staff. So it's like, I want to know what your storytelling instincts are like. This way, you work with me, you'll know what my storytelling instincts are like. There's no better way than doing it than telling a story than writing a comic. So so that's how that Flashpoint one shot came to be, and I learned a lot. I don't talk about it very much because I feel like all I can see are my mistakes on that one shot. So a lot of people like to think Infidel was my first work, and I let them think that. But there's a ton I learned working on that book.
And segueing, because you mentioned a little bit, and this was going to be our next question. What does an executive for DC's Media Team have to do? And you mentioned something about being a think tank. So was that a part of the gig?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, when I took the gig, nobody knew what it meant. And then we were kind of making it up at the same time. We would talk about this a lot. It was like, we were like a startup within this company that had been around for 50 years. And as a result, nobody knew what we were supposed to. It was pretty much, you had a bunch of people with different skill sets, and there were challenges every day. And so we would just figure out how to address the challenges based on the people that we had. And that was kind of the thing. And then what would eventually happen was, through the course of that, we would instantly drift to where our strengths were, and then positions would solidify around those strengths. So I was kind of brought in as like the Vertigo guy because I knew the Vertigo catalog really well. And originally the position was, all right, here's the entire DC library. What looks like a television show? What looks like a movie? How can we distill that so we could pitch it to other people around town? And then where our talent eventually lied was that, like, oh, with my taste, television made a lot of sense for me. And so I would eventually, work with Geoff to start and build like the DC TV division. So I got to be there around the birth of the Arrowverse and working with those guys starting the Arrowverse stuff. And I got to be there during DC's first like experimentations in television in network TV. So like I was there for, helping make the Gotham TV show on Fox and the Constantine show on CBS, and iZombie, which was like the first Vertigo TV show on the CW. So, so in the course of that process, I kind of became our TV department, and we started to solidify like what DC TV as a department could look like. Totally.
Switching over to some comic writing that I know, or that you should be proud of, talk to us about Infidel. And what was the motivation behind creating that book?
So Infidel was, it was my first book, and it was an idea I had, I think, like as of like 2009. So the book came out in 2018, so it's been sticking with me for about sort of 10 years. And it was this, it started off with this idea of, and it was combining a ton of stuff that was filling up my head at the time. So, and at that time, it was 2009. America was patting itself on the back because we had beat racism because we had elected a black president. But meanwhile, like Islamophobia was like spiking through the roof, and nobody was really talking about that. And so I thought like I wanted to tell a story that got into that. And then meanwhile, because I was working at Vertigo, I was watching all of these horror movies and reading these horror comics because Vertigo was kind of like, Vertigo did a lot of stuff, but its roots were in horror. And one of the things working with Karen Berger, who's like, no, Karen will say a lot that like Karen, probably was one of the pivotal forces in redefining comic book horror. And yet she will always say that she's not a huge horror fan. And working with her, I understood what that meant, because like if you're working in comics, it's all, especially if you're working for DC, it's all genre based. And any kind of genre, having a specific field of knowledge help grounds it, makes it better. So like if you know stuff about, crime or police procedurals and stuff, like it helps me for making a crime book. You know, stuff about science, it helps me making a science fiction book. Now, one of the things working with Karen, I realized like, oh wow, if you have a deep interest in psychology, it really helps making a horror book, because horror is about what's taboo. And so looking at her perspective, I looked at horror in this whole new perspective, and I started getting into horror movies and horror comics and all that sort of stuff. So as I was going through all this, I was, having these thoughts about like, Islamophobia and racism and what it was like in America, and they kind of merged together in this idea. And, I was working for DC at the time, so I didn't really have, DC had a non-compete. I couldn't write comics for anywhere else. At the time, I didn't believe editors should be writing for the company. I thought about doing it as a screenplay, but like I need time to write it. So, and I would write down I think I wrote down as far as like a treatment or something for it, but never did anything with it because I was always too busy, kind of stuck it in a drawer. Time passed, about 10 years passed, and every year it felt like that idea was more and more relevant. And it just got to the point where it's just like, I'm just gonna feel like an idiot if someone does this before I do it, considering I've had this idea for so long. And I had wanted to make a comic for a really long time. My schedule had cleared to a point where it's just like, oh, I think I should make a comic right now. And so I decided, like, let me take this and just make it into a comic. And I honestly thought that would be the end of my comic career. I think I was gonna make that book. It would sell like a couple thousand copies. I wouldn't be able to afford more. And then I just moved, but I get to say I made a comic, and I get to make this comic and all that kind of stuff. And the book ended up doing well, and it paved the way to do more comics. So I've been pretty grateful for that ever since.
I miss that old feel of Vertigo, and I know you probably do too. But yeah. As an editor for the now defunct Vertigo imprint, can you give us some of your 3 favorite Vertigo titles? Oh
God, that's tough for me. All right, well, The Invisibles is my all-time favorite one. That was my first Vertigo book. After that, it gets really tough. Not including stuff I've worked on, because I'm way too biased about that. I mean, it's hard not to love Preacher. I mean, I feel like I go with the sentimental ones. Like it's probably Invisibles, Preacher, and Sandman. Like those are the 3. Like those were so important, for the company. But like 100 Bullets is up there too, because that was such an important, like that changed what Vertigo was. Because it was like a fantasy publisher, and then 100 Bullets came out and opened it up to all this sort of stuff. I mean, Scalped is like the only comic I think I wrote a fan letter. I was like an editor, and I still wrote a fan letter. Guys at Scalped, like, so it's tough for me to pick favorites from Vertigo.
Every title that you mentioned are classics and are essential graphic novels, so you're definitely really right about that. Let's talk about The Good Asian now. And because for me, truth be told, I bought the book off the title alone.
Oh, nice. Awesome.
Because the title made me uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable. It was like, okay, should I say this out loud? It just felt weird to me, and I wanted to know what was behind it. So my question to you is, how long did it take you to develop the concept for The Good Asian?
It was one of those things that kicked around in my head. I mean, the good news / bad news is that like I'm always booked on more work than I really have bandwidth for. So I will get an idea, but it'll usually be a while before I have time in my schedule to write that idea. And the good news for that is it takes time. I have time to let it cook, to do ancillary reading, to sort of like, research it and all that sort of stuff. So I want to say the first germs of those ideas happened in like late 2016, late 2017. And my dad growing up, my dad was, my dad and my mom, whenever they would argue about politics, my dad would always lose. And my dad would always end the argument with being like, that's the problem with you Thai people. And my mom would be like, you're Thai, stop giving me this you Thai people stuff. And he's like, no, I'm Chinese. And she'd be like, you don't speak Chinese, you've never been to China, stop giving me this Chinese stuff. And then in his later years, he would become obsessed with China. He'd be watching all these Chinese documentaries about China and all this, everything this would be China, all this kind of stuff. And so when he passed, like part of my way of kind of dealing with that was to get into the stuff that he was interested in, and that was China. And for whatever reason that I still don't quite understand, what drew me, but not necessarily Chinese history or the history of Chinese culture, but where it intersected with American history. And that's how I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a ban banning all the Chinese coming into America from 1882 to 1943. And I was shocked I didn't know anything about it. And I was so shocked, like I had to research it a couple times just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting things. And I was like, wow, I can't believe there's this thing that I'm so ignorant of. And then that kind of combined with my knowledge of American pop culture. It's like, oh, isn't this weird that like in the 30s with Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto, Mr. Wong Detective, like Asian crime solvers were kind of a thing. It was like a trend. And it was this trend when Asians technically couldn't enter the country. The majority of Asians couldn't enter the country. That's such an interesting thing. And that would kind of be the germ, like, okay, so what if we did like use that Asian crime story to talk about crime solver, to talk about the fact that there's a ban on Asians, kind of America's first immigration ban. And so that was the genesis of The Good Asian. And then after that, it was just a lot of research to make sure I understood the world and the time period and all that kind of stuff.
The title, because I thought about that time period. You know, I think about, that time period and after too. You know, because we start getting into World War II and stuff like that. It gets, especially in Southern California, it was really, really rough for you know all Asian people. Okay, they were not discriminating on that type of stuff back then. The Good Asian, how I interpret it is like, okay, no, he's one of the good ones. Did I interpret that right?
Absolutely right. It was playing off that idea because like, and I think, and this is the thing that I thought was interesting. Asian Americans are very comfortable or very familiar with the concept of the model minority. That was something that was talked about with Asians a lot. And so this idea that, okay, you can succeed if you do everything right, if you're one of the good ones. And then time has kind of come and kind of taught us the lie about that, so the model minority myth and all that sort of stuff. But for a long time, and certainly our parents' generation, that was something that everybody believed. So one of the things, because that was so ingrained, I knew what the concept of the good Asian meant to Asians. And it's one of the things, like growing up, the thing I would hear a lot of the times, I wouldn't, the funny thing is, and to this day I still hear it, I hear a lot of people refer to it as the bad Asian. Like, oh yeah, I'm a bad Asian because I didn't do this, or I'm a bad Asian because I did that. That's all that's, I mean, the implication there's this what the good Asian looks like. Right. So to this day, like I hear people use the term bad Asian all the time. And so I knew that concept was very much what I wanted to talk about. And then I also knew too that there's a noir movie by Steven Soderbergh called The Good German. Like it felt kind of noir-ish, it felt within that world, a title that fit there. So it's like, okay, this feels about right. And then I think the other added benefit of that was I was so familiar with that term. I knew that if I use that term, I knew what I was talking about. I knew like what Asians other, and one of the things I did not realize, I guess, as much was how unfamiliar people outside of Asian Americans were with that term. So when the book was released, one of the things I thought was very interesting about the term "the good Asian" was, and this wasn't 100%. It was slightly intentional, but it wasn't as intentional as it had to be. It ended up being a very private message to other Asian Americans, being kind of like, oh no, this is this thing that we've known about for a really long time. And then having the book come out online, there were a lot of people like, I don't know how I feel about this title. And what would end up happening was Asians would come in on the feed or whatever, be like, no, here's what it means, da 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 da. So it became this sort of conversation point about, and there's a part of me that like, I always knew there was a loaded history behind this term, but what I was not aware of, because I had lived so much of its history and I had inherited so much of its history, was I was not aware that other people outside of Asian Americans were so unfamiliar with the term.
So Pornsak, I wanted to ask you about one of your collaborations.
Yeah.
What is it like collaborating with Neil Gaiman? We're referring to editing Sandman Dream Hunters and writing for Dead Boy Detectives under the Sandman imprint.
I mean, Neil, the thing about Neil, like Neil's superpower is that he's like the friendliest guy like ever. And so I would, I was working on Dream Hunters, and the Dream Hunters version I worked on was an interesting one where Neil weighed in and Neil was a creative consultant and all the way through. But P. Craig Russell did all the heavy lifting, as Craig has done on many of Neil's works. Like he does all the adaptation, and he does an amazing, beautiful job doing it. And Neil would sort of weigh in. So, but the thing was, like Neil would weigh in, and so I would talk to him on the phone about this little thing. And there's something so disarming and comfortable with him that you just end up talking to him and like just like chatting like if you're a friend. And then like way too late into it, for me anyway, I realized, oh, he has way more important things to do than me talking to me. I should like keep this professional and like wrap this up. But there's something just so like engaging and disarming about him that you just feel like, yeah, like, oh yeah, we can just talk and how are you doing? And then you realize he's Neil Gaiman. He's got way better things to be doing right now.
You're important too, and you have your Eisner nominations.
Oh, thank you.
So tell us why everyone should be picking up Man's Best.
Oh, Man's Best. I love Man's Best. Man's Best is so different from what I normally do. Man's Best is Homeward Bound in space. It's about these 3 emotional support animals that live on a spaceship. And the spaceship crash lands and aliens comes and takes their owner, takes their captain. And now the animals got to get in their mech suits and sort of save them. So it's kind of the opposite of everything I do. It is hopeful. It is joyous. It is hopefully adventurous and swashbuckling. But also for me, it's a very personal story too. It's very much about like what happens to friendships during crisis, and it was very much taking things and feelings and variations of conversations I had coming through the pandemic and lockdown and all that kind of stuff, and sort of putting it into sort of a sci-fi story about pets. And so yeah, it's surprisingly a very personal story for me. It's one of the few, but normally the way I work is that I'm not one of those confessional writers where something happens to me and you see it in one of my books. That's not generally how I work, primarily because with the stuff that I've done, so many of the experiences are so heightened and they're so unlike things anyone can kind of live. So it takes the spirit of things I've done and infuses it with it. Man's Best is one of those few books where every issue, there's a scene that's like, oh, I know when I had that conversation and like with who, and I can kind of see it in every issue. And it's been an interesting process because by the end of the book, not just the characters, but I learned something. And unlike any of my books, I can kind of see like, oh, wow, these are the things that happened in my life that led me to believe this. And I don't think I've ever had that experience with a book so far. But it's also this book about dogs and cats in space with mech suits and fighting aliens, and it's got Jesse Lonergan art, and I'm a god, it's worth it for the art. The art it's some of the best, most cutting edge, pushing the genre, the boundaries of the medium. I love working with Jesse so much.
Awesome.
And I've been waiting for the next issue.
It's coming out. I mean, by the time this airs, I think all 5 issues will be out. So I can't wait to see what people think of the whole book.
Amazing. All right, this year you're nominated for another Eisner. Nominated for The Good Asian is back up again,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
yes,
what?
it is.
So what does it mean to you? You know, as a writer and a person that loves writing and has a passion for writing, to be nominated for one of the highest honors in the medium.
It means a lot, honestly. I mean, for the Eisners, it's the validation of your peers, and I don't think I realized how much that meant to me until it came around. It means a ton. It means a ton. This particular time, I actually think while the nomination is for The Good Asian, I actually think it's a nomination for Jeff Powell, our designer, because he did such a fantastic job on the hardcover. I mean, anytime anyone sees a hardcover, everyone's like, this is such a beautiful book and all that. And I'll be honest, because The Good Asian had won 2 years ago, and the talk about it had felt like it had sort of died out because it came out like 2 years ago. I was very surprised when the nomination came on, but at the same time I shouldn't be, because like Jeff did such a great job on the book. Anytime anyone sees a book for the first time, they're like, wow, this is so pretty. I'm like, I know, it looks so pretty. I have nothing to do with that. It looks so pretty. So this one means a lot to me because I feel like, and Jeff too, and I work with a lot of guys who are like this, Jeff is all about the story. Jeff wants things to look nice, but he doesn't want to call attention to himself. So it's all about just like making something beautiful that isn't ego driven. So I really would love it for him to get this because I feel like he deserves it, for always putting the work first.
All right, Pornsak, last question. Is there something that we haven't discussed that you want fans to know about?
By the time this comes out, I think it's coming out July. So like next month, I've got like this one shot coming out through DC where I'm writing this character they have named called Failsafe that Chip Zdarsky created. But the way DC got me was basically like, you want to write sociopathic Batman for like an issue? I'm like, yeah, I want to write sociopathic Batman for an issue. So I was like, yeah, I don't care what it is. I'll write sociopathic Batman. That sounds like a lot of fun. And this is one of those weird things. So by the time this airs, my next project with Image will have been announced, but it hasn't been announced yet.
Okay.
So all I can say is my next project will be announced. It'll be coming out in September. It is. I don't think it's what anyone would expect from me. It's simultaneously what I think makes so much sense once it'll be announced, but I don't think what anyone would expect my next project to be. I'm really excited about it. In many ways, every project I've taken on for the past 2 or 3 years, 2 years since The Good Agent, has been like preparing me for this project. I'm crazy excited about it.
Can you give us a one-word hint?
I don't even know what to.
If it's an Image project, it's a completely original idea.
It's an Image project. I will say, I can probably say, I don't think it'll get into any trouble. It's called The Horizon Experiment.
Okay.
And I can guarantee no one will expect what it actually is.
Boom.
But by the time people listen to this, the word will have been out. But yeah.
Awesome. Pornsak, thank you so much for joining us. You always have a home here on the Sig Slayers station, by the way. This is a fantastic show. Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Sig Slayers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Pornsak Pichetshote. We are out. Peace.
Sig Slayers.